Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Shattered Lives. We decided to get on here and talk once again about Gerry Hutch because it is the saga that keeps on giving, and there's a huge fallout to it. And we're also here to talk about Jason Bonney and Paul Murphy, who were due to be sentenced today, but we'll explain why the sentencing didn't exactly get going today. So without further ado, just to introduce Michael O'Toole, crime correspondent with the Irish Daily Star. Hello again.
Paul. Hello, Paul Healy, chief reporter. You were back in the special today. Had you missed it? It was 3 weeks today since the verdict.
Oh, it's like deja vu. Going back to the special criminal court. It's just, what would a Monday be without more court?
Before we get into it, were there many crowds at this today, or was it just a procedural thing, really?
Procedural, much quieter affair. I mean, a fair bit of media, obviously, but the public interest, I suppose, at large has waned a bit, obviously, because Gerry Hutch has been acquitted. That was the headline of the day. This really was about Jason Bonney and Paul Murphy. But as you reported yesterday, Mick, I suppose, and we didn't really realise that this would become an issue, that the case of Gerry Hutch would be called again, in that he is seeking to recuperate, or seeking to have the state pay his legal fees, because he's won his case, so he's entitled to make this particular application, and it's a potentially a huge sum of money. So you reported, I think it was upwards of 400,000, could be even more than that, though. You know, I mean, I think I saw an estimate, something like 4,000 or 5,000 per day. Now that's just that's just like procedural for like having your barrister, your legal team in court every day. So there's 52 days in this trial. So if you're just counting that, that's $250,000. But then there's plenty of other fees that come with that as well. So
yeah, I mean, I'll just explain this. And also there's a thing called a brief fee. So whenever you take on a barrister, you have to pay them a certain amount. It could be, and it's all a movable feast, and it's an agreement between you and the barrister. It could be 10 grand, 15 grand, 20 grand, but that's the ballpark figure. However, you're right. I mean, it is about 4 grand a day for a senior counsel. Brendan Grehan, I mean, he earned his corn in this case, and he's entitled to every single penny, because he effectively won Gerry Hutch's liberty. And people will write about this. It was a fantastic performance by Brendan Grehan, but you know, he's entitled to charge a fee. So now, what was really interesting about this, and it only occurred to me a few weeks before the trial came on, that you've been at when people are charged with murder, Paul, or serious offences, there's usually an application for legal aid on the very first appearance. So say if someone's charged with murder today, the last thing will be, Judge, can we get medical treatment for the accused, and also can we get legal aid? And there was no legal aid application by Mr Hutch, and it totally, you and I were at it, passed me by.
Yeah, it passed me by as well, to be honest. And it only kind of occurred to us at the end of the case that actually there hadn't been an application for legal aid. And that is fascinating, because that's highly unusual in a case of this magnitude, certainly, that a person wouldn't apply for legal aid, and they would now be applying for their costs to be covered by the state in hindsight, obviously, because he's won his case. Had he lost his case, he would have had to pay every penny of this himself. But I think we're probably going to get to it now, but the reason behind maybe why Mr Hutch did not apply for legal aid is because you have to provide what's called a statement of means, and to explain where your money is coming from. Perhaps he didn't want to get into that. We know that Gerry Hutch is a man with plenty of money, so maybe that he feared being possibly put under scrutiny in relation to that. It's not clear what the reasoning is, but he certainly is a man with properties all across Europe. We know that, factually speaking, had a settlement with the Criminal Assets Bureau, £1.2 million. So I mean, he is a man with plenty of money. But what happens next now is fascinating, because what the development today was that the state is actually objecting to his particular application to have his legal costs covered by the state. So it'll be interesting to see what their objections is, and that might all then get trashed out as to, well, Mr Hutch is a man of means, or whatever.
Yeah, let's go back just a wee bit. Yeah, so it is very, I'm going to say it's like hen's teeth. Someone accused of a very serious charge like murder or rape, something that goes to the Central Criminal Court, and the Special Criminal Court is effectively treated like the Central Criminal Court, so it's the top court. I was speaking with several really experienced court reporters. Personally, in my 25 years, I've never heard of somebody charged with murder not seeking legal aid, and I checked with other eminent court reporters, and they weren't aware of any. So I think we'd be safe enough saying this is, if it's not the first, if it's not the only, it's one of less than a handful. So it's very, very rare. And even, he could have sought legal aid at any stage in the process. It was September 2022 when he was charged, and the case started in October last year. So it's 13 months effectively, and at that there was no stage. So what has to happen is he comes to an agreement with his legal team, and he receives a Section 50 letter. Under the law, under Section 50 of this law, your legal team have to send you a letter saying that this is a rough estimate of how much it's going to be. So we don't know, but you're right, 250,000. But even it was explained to me yesterday when I was speaking to some legal sources, that's only for the barristers. Then you've got the legal team, and they can, just speaking generally, solicitors charge every time they have to photograph a page, literally. And sometimes there can be hundreds of thousands of pages. I'm sure there were hundreds, tens of thousands of pages in this, but that's on top of their time and everything. So look, it was speculated to me. I think 250,000, I know that's been reported on, is on the low side. I think 400,000, if not higher, that's a lot of money. Now, I did note what you were saying about the state objecting to that. I wonder, is part of the reason for that Miss Tara Byrne's judgment, what did she say about Gerry Hutch and criminality, about control of the firearms, the Kalashnikovs and that sort of stuff. So I wonder, will the state go, well, this man was declared not guilty, but there were things in your statement or your findings, Your Honour, that do point to criminality and that leave Mr Hutch with a problem.
Well, I wonder even, can they bring in the larger history of the settlement with the Criminal Assets Bureau and his past in that regards, and his connections to criminality, and the allegations that he is at the head of this Hutch criminal organised group, which has been proven in court to exist. All of that I think they may potentially bring into their objections. It'd be fascinating to see. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that he took a case to the Supreme Court, and he did. So he took other cases that with the same legal team that's obviously going to add to that massive bill. And did he take a bit of a gamble as well? I mean, like, if he had been found not guilty, he obviously must have been prepared to pay a hefty sum. So he has the money, or at least
he does.
And
it's interesting because when I was looking at the question of fees yesterday, he was ordered to pay costs in relation to that Supreme Court bid. He lost it, so I can't remember, was it full cost or half cost, but he had, and going to the Supreme Court is a good whack. And from memory, that was to the Supreme Court because he wanted a jury to hear his case, not the non-jury special criminal court.
Yes,
but he did lose that, and he was hit with a bill, so he has that, and he can't recoup that because he lost that case. He can recoup these bill fees, but he can't recoup that one. So that's more than a few quid already. So it'll be interesting to see what Miss Justice Tara Byrne decides in the coming days. I think is it Friday this is going to make a decision? It
will be Friday, yes. She was eager to get this heard today, but neither side was prepared. In fact, they felt that this was up for mention and that they weren't prepared to discuss it today. So I expect it to be dealt with on Friday. I don't expect Gerry Hutch to show up, although he's entitled to, but there's no obligation on him to show up. But perhaps this is a good segue to just mention, maybe this is one of the reasons why Gerry Hutch is still here. There's been a bit of a question mark over why hasn't he left the country. Plenty of reports, including by ourselves, that the belief was, certainly among Guardia, that Gerry Hutch wouldn't stick around because of the threat to his life, and he has a whole life for himself over in Spain and abroad, so why would he stay here? But he appears to have remained here for the last 3 weeks, going into the 4th week now since his acquittal. And an interesting story came out, which I think is worth mentioning, in the Sunday Independent, quoting a Hutch relative, basically giving the reasoning, or the alleged reasoning, as to why Gerry is still here. And I thought there was an interesting quote in it to the Guardia and their supposed failure, and that he is here as a reminder to them of their failure. And then that he intends to, for the time being anyway, stick around. So I thought that was worth discussing. So I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I can see what I wonder, is it sort of him trying to maybe rub the guards' noses in it, because it was I'll put it this way, it was a spectacular success for Gerry Hutch and for Brendan Gray, and there's no doubt about that. So look, all the guidance we've got, and I'm sure you've spoken to several sources, Guardia expect Gerry Hutch to leave. they did expect him to leave very quickly, but they would be of the belief that, and there's something we'll talk about in the Sunday Indo story which backs up that view. In my view, they did expect him to leave because of fears for his security, and that, as you're right, his life is really abroad. When you remember, he spent, before he was arrested and before even he was being sought by authorities, he was living outside Ireland, and he was living the vast bulk of his time outside Ireland. So his focus, and if you remember also, when he was being extradited, do you remember one of the things he tried in the legal system in Spain? He wanted to be, if he was found guilty, he wanted to be put in jail in Spain because he was a resident, a legal resident in Spain. So, that shows that his whole focus, or the whole prism of which he's living, is in Spain. So I don't think it's unexpected that he'll go back there. It's just a question of when. And that Sunday Indo story for me said, I'm effectively reading it was, he's going to go, but he's not going to go just yet, and he'll pick his time to go. But I think it will be sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if he's just sticking around. This might be one of the reasons why he's sticking around this particular question over the costs. Maybe he's getting certain affairs in order with the intention of never returning. We don't know. But I also
sorry, just one thing. But even if he wins, I think he's got a very good chance of winning his cause, because he won it. But despite what we'll say, and it's up to the judges. But even if he does, that won't happen very quickly, because it has to go. The state will look at what the bill is. Then, if they're not happy, if they think, well, we want it to be lower, it goes to a taxing master, who's an independent judge in the High Court, who decides what it's going to be. That's not going to be clear tomorrow, and it'll be a good long while. But the hills of the hunt, my legal sources were expecting that he will get money, and it'll come out of the National Treasury Management Agency, the one that looks after our pensions. They're the ones who will ultimately pay this. So it's the taxpayer forking it out anyway. So that'll just be interesting.
Wow. Yeah, and also on that Sunday Independent story, I thought it was worth mentioning the allegation that Gerry Hutch feels safer here than he has prior. Given the fact that the Kinahan cartel is so weakened. We did discuss that possibility. I still think there's a feeling, you've mentioned it there, that the guards still feel that there is an active threat against him and indeed his brother Patsy Hutch as well. That was mentioned in that story. But apparently he does feel that he is safer, given that the Kinahans are effectively being hunted and that much of their more dangerous lieutenants are in prison or on the run. But I still think in the midst of all of that, it would still be wise for him to move on, and I'd say he probably will.
That line was near the bottom of the story, and for me it was the most interesting aspect. It was essentially the Gerry Hutch relative going, he feels that Kinahan is still intent on murdering him and Patsy. So I that jumped out at me. Now maybe that's the prism through which I look at things and look at stories, but yeah, that was a big thing for me, that Gerry Hutch, or the relative says Gerry Hutch still feels that he's in danger from the Kinahans, even though they are degraded, and we know they're degraded, but they've still got lots of money, and money can buy lots of things.
Yes, well, we'll continue to follow that with interest. There are other things we want to talk about in this podcast, but the Gerry Hutch story is one that keeps on giving. Shall we talk about Jason Bonney and Paul Murphy?
Yes, so they've both been convicted of facilitating the murder.
Yes,
and the maximum they can face is 15 years. You've got the actual offence there. It might be worth, because we always use shorthand for facilitating, but it's a bit more complicated than that.
Yes, well, I mean, effectively what they have been found guilty of is driving the getaway vehicles. And that's a very simple way of explaining it, because when you're trying to write copy and put out the entire charge, it's very lengthy. But just to explain to people, it's under the Criminal Justice Act 2007. And it is if a person is found guilty under the offence, that they possess any control of an article that gives circumstances that give rise to the reasonable inference that he or she possesses it for a purpose connected with the commission, preparation, facilitation, or instigation of an offence. And in this case, it was the murder of David Byrne. And the item that they used, obviously, was the vehicle. They provided the vehicles in the aftermath of the hit to help the hit team escape. And you're right, the headline sentence on this appears to be 15 years, but that is at the upper tier of this offence, and we don't expect that either of these men will get anything close to that. And there's a reasonable inference that that's the case if you just look at what was said in court today. So in relation to Jason Bonney, he has no previous convictions. Now that is oftentimes in the past, that is a huge mitigating factor where you haven't come to Garda attention previously, and a senior Garda did give evidence to that effect today, that Jason Bonney was not somebody that was, quote, on their radar. He didn't come to Garda attention prior. And that will stick to him and his record. And then the other thing is there were multiple letters handed into the court in favor of Jason Bonney in terms of his past, in terms of working within the community, working in the Trinity Boxing Club, and with his family also. He took on a young lad and fostered him and raised him, and there was a letter from that particular man who now lives in a foreign jurisdiction saying that Jason Bonney was a huge influence on him, and he wouldn't be the man he is today if it wasn't for him. All of that will stick to him in terms of mitigating factors in lessening that 15 years right down to something else. And then for Paul Murphy, it's the same thing. Letters were handed in relation to him. Now, I thought the interesting nugget with Paul Murphy, that this kind of shocked me because things are sort of said and then you move on. I was stunned to learn that he had 60 plus, I think it was 67 previous convictions. This is somebody we've never heard of prior to this, but he had been in and out of the courts over the course of his life. Now, to put that into context, it's since the 1970s. But it also turned out that he was 45 of these convictions were under a previous name. So at some point in his life, he changed his name. So 45 of those convictions, and many of them are road traffic offences, but he also has convictions for larceny and for public order. So certainly in his case, he has a little bit more difficulty in terms of, he can't argue that he didn't come to Garda attention previously. You're talking over a 30, 40-year period, all right, but he has got convictions there. So that may be considered possibly by the judges to be an aggravating factor. But one of the cases that was mentioned, a previous case that was mentioned in the defense of Paul Murphy, was that of Martin Aylmer, who we know was convicted of the same offence, which is facilitating a murder. In this case, it was the facilitation of the murder of Michael Barr in the Sunset House, April 2016. And he received, I think, 5 years for his offence. So that was 15 years, and it was brought down. And in his case, he provided mobile phones. So Paul Murphy's defence barrister, Bernard Condon, basically said that if you are to, which they'd have found his client as being guilty, you can't prove, there's no proof, no evidence provided that he knew what he was getting himself in for. Okay, he provided the vehicle, he provided his taxi, but he didn't know that a murder had taken place. He'd signed up for something, but possibly, maybe, but you can't argue that he had a central role, involvement in the shooting, in the murder, and that had to be taken into account. We'll see if the judges do take that into account, but all of those factors will mean that 15-year sentence is going to be cut right down. So I would guess, and I'm not a legal expert, but just on the basis of the previous case that I mentioned to you, Martin Aylmer, and those mitigating factors, I'd say you're talking about 5 years or so for each. But what do you think?
Well, there's a couple of things. We also should mention that Jonathan Dowdall and his father Patrick,
yes,
are both they were both convicted of the same offence of facilitating. So,
yes.
So we will just remind listeners what they got.
Yeah, Jonathan Dowdall got 4 years, and the father, Patrick, got 2 years, and he was released last week. So he didn't even do 2 years.
So there is one difference in this, and I think Martin Aylmer, I think he pleaded guilty.
He did, yes.
Yes, and from memory, a couple of other people on the Kinahan side have also pleaded guilty to facilitating. Now, there's a difference here, I think. Neither Bonney nor Murphy, as we know, pleaded guilty. So judges usually shave off whatever they were thinking. Say they were thinking about, say that just purely theoretically, they'd go, right, but the headline here will be 7 years, but I'm going to take off 2 years because of a guilty plea. That didn't happen in this case. So that might,
that'll go against them.
That will obviously stand against them because they didn't plead at the earliest phase. But look, you're right. It's not going to be anywhere near, famous last words, it's not going to be anywhere near 10 years. So maybe 5 or 6, maybe.
Yeah, I would be surprised. And then also, we don't know what the judges are going to take into account, but certainly Miss Justice Tara Burns took real issue, in particular with Jason Bonney, in that he provided 2 alibi witnesses that pushed forward this narrative that it was his father driving the BMW X5 that helped flat cap Kevin Murray escape from the aftermath of the Regency. He tried to argue that his elderly father, a man who couldn't defend himself, was the driver of that vehicle. And we had two witnesses that basically pushed that narrative. But the judge was very annoyed about that and called it the most malevolent lie that had been told to the court. I think that's going to stand against them massively. I think in her judgment of Jason Bonney, she's going to say, you perpetuated this quote unquote lie and attempted to have us believe it. I think that'll be hugely aggravating. But I still think, on the basis of everything we've said, I'd be famous last words. I'd be surprised if it was as much as 10. They certainly are facing up to 15. But yeah,
I would suggest it'll be over 5.
Right.
But
yeah, our listeners are going to give out to us when we're completely wrong now. But
yeah, but just there are 2 points for me. The aggravating factor of that whole, the alibis, and as obviously the judge got stuck in the Bonney about that, and secondly, not pleading guilty. So that would shave stuff off. So yeah, might be a wee bit higher than 5. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, just on that, I did an interview where I spoke to somebody last week. Peter Tyrrell's his name. He's one of those 2 witnesses that were there for Bonney. We didn't really speak because of obviously everything that happened with Gerry Hutch. We didn't speak in great detail about the case against either of these 2 men towards the end. But Peter Tyrrell, what's interesting about him is that he wasn't a friend of Jason Bonney. In fact, they were involved. He was involved in civil litigation with them over ownership of a leisure club out there in North Dublin, and that was said in court. So he was no friend of Jason Bonney, and that's what made for me. That's what made his evidence more interesting than just me personally speaking, than the evidence of another lady who supported Bonney's claim. She was a friend, and there was history between them. But Peter Tyrrell basically said that he saw Jason Bonney's dad driving that BMW, at a very crucial time. You're talking about 5 minutes after the Regency shooting at the Artane roundabout there. So that's about a 5-minute drive or so from the Regency Hotel, and he can vividly remember Willie Bonney, who's no longer with us, can't defend himself, driving that BMW. And he says, because I basically confronted him on this, and I said, well, now the judge has turned around and said that you effectively lied to the court, and he doesn't agree. And he also made this point, and I thought this was interesting. He could care less that Jason Bonney has been convicted of this crime. I just went into court and said what I saw, and he believed that in his mind, that's what he saw, and he felt that he needed to tell the court that, because his evidence came at the 11th hour. His wife had previously given evidence earlier in the trial because the guards had come to their house in Artane and had taken CCTV footage, and on that footage was the BMW X5 passing by their house, seconds after it had just come through the Artane roundabout. And it was only after she gave evidence that Peter Tyrrell said, "Oh, I remember that." This is what he said to me. "Oh, I remember that." And he came forward to Jason Bonney's solicitor and said, "Well, I can remember it being Willie Bonney driving that vehicle, and I can remember it because he drove at speed right up the back of me." And he remembers it to this day. So he was a lastminute.com witness, and there was controversy over whether he could even give evidence, but he did give evidence, and he was challenged on that. And even last week, he said to me, "Look, I know what I saw. It was Willie Bonney driving that car. I knew Willie Bonney was involved in a civil case against him. We're not friends." And it stuck out in his mind because he said he was driving so fast. He said literally up my hole, and he can remember that. I said, "Is it possible you could have been mistaken?" And he was like, I know what I saw." Now, I also spoke to his wife, who said he might have been mistaken, maybe, but he does maintain that is what he saw. In the end of the day, it's irrelevant whether you believe him or not now, because Jason Bonney has been convicted, irregardless. And the evidence of Peter Tyrrell was effectively thrown out and deemed to be part of this malevolent lie. But I do think it's interesting that he stuck to his guns, and he's saying, "Look, I saw Willie Bonney driving that BMW." I just think it was worth discussing, because it's a fascinating, I suppose, argument, that like he's saying that his elderly father, a man in his 70s, was effectively a getaway driver in the most sophisticated gangland hit there's ever been in this country. I mean, it's hard to imagine But look, there you go.
Yes, just as an aside, it was a sophisticatedly planned gangland hit, but it was badly executed.
Yeah.
Right. No, anyway, yes. What my thoughts on what Mr. Taylor is saying, and I think we spoke about this before in one of the previous pods. You can be wrong, but you can still have an honestly held belief.
Yeah.
I think it's hard, you can go into the witness box and say, this is what I believe. Now, the judge may accept it, but that's no criticism. People can be wrong. As the wife said, he may be mistaken. And, nobody should be criticized. That's his honestly held belief. And he went in and he swore and he got, but people can be mistaken.
Yeah, I thought personally, again, I'm only giving my own personal opinion, but I thought when he gave evidence at the time, that was the strongest witness for Jason Bonney, and that was the strongest argument that he had against him possibly being the driver of the car, because you had an individual who seemingly had no personal relationship with him. But as I said, that's irrelevant now. And even though
Miss Justice Tara Burns didn't agree.
She didn't agree. Yeah, I think it's fascinating to see now. Like, if they get 5 years, even with that, they'll probably serve 3 in prison. So,
well, you get 25%. So they were put into custody on the 17th upon conviction, weren't they?
They were.
So they've had 3 weeks in custody. So that'll be. I know it's not a long time, but that will be taken into account. So it'll be backdated to the 17th of April when they get put in. But yes, so it's backdated, so that'll be a month off, and then you serve 75% effectively of whatever you're given. You can go for enhanced remission, but I think that's more for long-term prisoners. So yeah, it'll do, if they get 4, he'll do 3.
Yeah,
or they'll do 3.
There's 2 things I wanted to say about these that we can get to say in the other pod. Like, obviously, this was a huge victory for the guards and for the state, in that 2 people were convicted in relation to the murder of David Byrne. 4 people, really. You've got Patrick Dowdall, Jonathan Dowdall, and now Jason Bonney and Paul Murphy. And let's not understate that fact that there were convictions in this case, and the guards do feel that they got some victory in this. Obviously, and even the Garda Commissioner said it was a setback that Gerry Hutch walked, and there are reasons for that that we've outlined previously. But that was a victory for the guards, is what I want to mention. And the other thing that I noticed, just not a body language expert, but it was interesting to watch both of these men in court today and to see the difference, because throughout the trial, Jason Bonney and Paul Murphy were always kind of bantering and joking around and talking to everybody. I mean, if you saw them in the smoking area of the CCJ, they'd come over and say, "Ah, how you?" And you'd say, "Oh, how you?" They were very, despite the fact that they were on trial, they were quite. They never really looked particularly stone-faced, but the difference 3 weeks in prison makes, they just looked totally shaken, I thought, in court today.
Reality bites. And look, the other thing about the Guardia investigation, we also have to remember it's still alive, and the guards made a fresh appeal for information after the acquittal of Mr. Hutch. So, and we know that there are other people, shall we say, of interest. So the investigation is very much ongoing, and people have been named. So we'll soon see what happens if there's any other developments. I'd say there probably will be, but who knows?
Exactly. Well, we'll keep doing pods for as long as there are developments, no doubt.
Great stuff.
Okay, thanks very much for listening to us. We'll be back to you later in the week, maybe with something else to talk about. We'll see.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody.